What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at something that Cameron Bertuzzi has called Hunter's Dilemma.
Here's the dilemma. You can basically pick one. You can either A, claim to merely lack belief in God, or you can compare God to beings that you believe don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a dilemma at all, and if you want to know why it's not a dilemma, then you'll have to stay tuned. Alright, heathens, well, Cameron and Braxton go through a lot of setup in order to get to the Hunter's Dilemma, so I don't want it to seem like I'm trying to misrepresent or anything like that. So we're going to go through their whole setup process here to get to Hunter's Dilemma, and then we're going to deal with some supposed objections to it, and I'm going to explain how those don't cover my problem with the dilemma. But let's go ahead and let's find our way through their setup.
Okay, so I have some JPEGs that I made. So JPEGs is like just a fancy word for some images. I made some images about some things that we're going to talk about today. So the first thing I want to talk about is scales of belief, and this is all going to be relevant to the challenge. We're going to get to the challenge in just a few minutes. So when I was thinking about how Theist, I think, and when I've hear atheists do debates or talk on the subject of belief in God and not being convinced by arguments, I came to this analogy, I think, about beliefs in a scale. And so I want to just go over it and get everyone's thoughts, including Braxton's. So when I hear some people talk, or some atheists talk about belief in God and what it takes to believe in God and evidence and arguments and all that kind of thing, to me, it sounds like they've got a scale in their mind of like 0 to 100. So 0 is you have no belief about P. P is just any proposition you can put in there. So like God exists. So 0 would be no belief about P, and 100 will be you fully believe that P is true.
Well, yeah, I would say that that's generally a good way to talk about whether or not you believe something to be true. Now, in street epistemology, generally you'll have somebody asking another person, like on a scale of 0 to 100, how much do you believe in a certain proposition? And, they'll answer appropriately. So I mean, I feel like this is the appropriate way to talk about somebody's belief in something, or whether or not somebody does hold a belief in something. So yeah, I don't see a problem with the 0 to 100 scale.
And I think some atheists think that that's all there is to the scale. And you can see this is the top scale. There's 2 scales here.
I mean, yeah, that's all there is to any scale of this kind. In this particular context, 0 to 100 is really all you're dealing with.
But in reality, there's actually a sort of negative side to it where you believe that P is false. So you can believe that P is true, or you can believe that P is false. And so that's why I think the correct way to think about this is that you can go from 0 to 100, but you can also go from 0 to sort of negative 100.
What Cameron is doing right here is he's mashing 2 different scales together for one particular topic that he wants to talk about. But in reality, he's talking about 2 different propositions. One scale is whether or not you believe something to be true, and the other scale is whether or not you believe that something to be false. These are 2 different propositions, and he does this as a way to convolute the conversation. Later, you're going to see how Cameron mashing these 2 propositions together helps him equivocate the God proposition that we're talking about in Hunter's Dilemma. So I'm fine if this is the scale that you want to go with, but you do have to recognize that we're talking about 2 different propositions here. One proposition is the belief that something is true. Another proposition is the belief that it's false.
So that shows that this is actually a very important feature. This is actually a very helpful diagram, and I like the way that you've laid it out here. It's handy.
Yes, it is handy for you, Braxton, because it really does exemplify the equivocation that you're using in your Hunter's dilemma. So I can see how you would find it useful. Next, they go on to talk about burden of proof.
So the burden of proof is often, you could say, misconstrued or misunderstood online. And I think that atheists will probably want to say the same thing about theists a lot of the times. But here's how I think about it, and how I think a lot of philosophers, a lot of people in academia think about what's called the burden of proof. So in here, T just means God exists. And so basically there's three different attitudes that you could do, or three different things that you could say about T. So you could assert that T is false. That's all the way on the left. And in that case, you do have a burden of proof. We're going to get to an example in a moment of, like, a different example apart from God, why that has to be the case. In the middle, you can assert nothing about T. You could say nothing about God's existence. And in that case, you don't have any burden of proof because you're not saying anything about T. You're not saying anything about God's existence. But then on the further side, assert that T is true. This is the context in which most theists are operating. They're asserting that theism is true, giving arguments and evidence. And in that case, everybody agrees you've got a burden of proof. My point is that on the opposite side of the scale, where you assert that T is false, then you still have a burden of proof.
I would agree with this. If you're going to assert that something is false, then you should probably have evidence to support claiming that that is false. But the problem is that Cameron and Braxton, as well as most other Christians, think that all atheists land on the far left side. The far left side being that we're saying that God does not exist, as if it's a positive assertion that God does not exist, that we know God not to exist. But as we'll find with Hunter's dilemma, they're talking about two different topics, and they are equivocating them together in order to convolute the conversation. Now, this could be on purpose, like they're doing it and they know that they're doing it, or they could just be mistaken about what atheists are talking about when they're talking about a deity versus their specific version of God. Because when I say that the Yahweh God does not exist, I'm making a positive assertion, and I can back that up with evidence, and I do give evidence. Most atheists out there would be perfectly fine giving their particular best piece of evidence that disproves the Yahweh God existing. But if we shift to a discussion on a deity in general, my guess is that most atheists out there would say that they don't know whether or not a deity exists. And that's really where our agnostic atheism shines through. So just to be clear, I am a Gnostic atheist on the specific definitions of God that we have, specifically the Abrahamic gods or any of the other gods that we currently have definitions for. But when we shift the conversation to a deity or this ambiguous deity definition, I am an agnostic atheist. I don't know whether or not he exists, but I don't believe him to exist. That would be the non-belief, or what some people say as the lack of belief in a God.
The challenge has to do with, again, this definition that some atheists give about atheism, this sort of lack of belief in gods. On the American Atheist website, you can see here, atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God, nor does it answer any other question about what a person believes. It is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. Atheism is too often defined incorrectly as a belief system. To be clear, atheism is not a disbelief in gods or a denial of gods. It is a lack of belief in gods. So we have this very clear exposition of what it means to be an atheist, and this is a lack of belief in gods. That's what the American atheists say.
I will say, don't try to confuse what one particular organization defines as atheism with how all atheists apply the label of atheist, okay? Because there are some people out there that don't like the lack of belief definition. They feel that it's too open. I feel that lack of belief or a non-belief are essentially the same thing that we're talking about. And I would agree with a non-belief in a deity. I just simply don't believe in your particular God nor any particular God. And so I feel like that's a more meaningful thing to do in a conversation is to figure out what they actually mean by their label, because there could be people out there that are Gnostic atheists about this ambiguous God definition, saying that, you know, this God cannot exist whatsoever. And there are plenty of atheists out there like that. But it's very important for you to understand what they mean and what their actual beliefs are, rather than going by one particular organization's definition of atheism. I really hate the definition discussion. And so I feel like we could just move past it, because it really doesn't get us anywhere to argue over definitions.
Now, what Braxton has noticed is that there's a conflict between that and what some atheists say sometimes. So from the same people, the same organization, the American Atheist, this is a billboard that they produced. Just skip church. It's all fake news. Now, to me, that sounds like that's not just like, oh, okay, we just lack belief in God. You're claiming that it's fake. You're asserting that that thing does not exist. And so there's a tension here.
No, there's not really any kind of tension. You're just not exactly understanding what the context is of that billboard. The billboard appears in the United States. So they're talking to Christians, obviously, because they have the nativity scene up there. And so because they're talking to Christians, it's talking about a very specific definition of a deity, your Abrahamic God, Yahweh, Jesus, whatever. They are talking about a very specific definition of a deity. And so when you start talking about specific definitions, that's where we have evidence to say, no, that is definitely not true. That is false. It is fake news, as the billboard said. So there's no conflict here, because they're not talking about an ambiguous deity figure. They're talking about a specific definition of a deity. It's a subtle nuance here, and I can understand how Christian apologists, being that they feel like the entire world revolves around their particular religion, wouldn't understand the subtle nuance between an ambiguous deity and their specific God figure, because to them, their specific God figure or deity figure is the only one that exists and is true. So I understand not getting the subtle context switch here, but just take a minute and try to understand that subtle nuance.
So let's get to Hunter's dilemma. I've called it Hunter's dilemma because I first heard it from Braxton Hunter. So here's the challenge. Here's the dilemma that I think these kinds of atheists who accept the sort of lack of belief definition. Here's the dilemma. You can basically pick one. You can either A, claim to merely lack belief in God, or you can compare God to beings that you believe don't exist.
Yes, and Hunter's dilemma suffers from the exact thing that you suffered from, Cameron, when looking at that American Atheist billboard. Hunter is confusing the claim of an ambiguous deity with the claim of his specific God definition. So these two positions are not hypocritical to hold. Like, it's not either or. You can definitely have a non-belief in an ambiguous deity, but also have a very active positive belief that your particular God definition, your particular deity definition, does not exist. You can hold those two different positions there. I get that it's kind of complicated, but that's why it's very important to define what you're talking about when you're having these conversations. Are we talking about an ambiguous God deity? If you are, then I'm agnostic on that particular point. I don't know. I just know that your arguments for this deity that you think exists do not actually support the conclusion. That's all that I know. But then when we get to you claiming that this deity is your particular version of God, that's where I become very Gnostic and know that it's not true, it's fake, it's not supported whatsoever by the evidence. And so therefore it does not exist.
Mm-hmm. And so here's like one of the most common examples that you hear in B is sometimes atheists will compare God's existence to like Santa Claus or to fairies, where not only are they saying that atheism is this sort of like lack of belief kind of situation, they're also in certain scenarios, even in the debate, will say look, belief in God is just like belief in Santa. There's like I have tweets of this and everything. So there's tons. This happens, but the challenge again is basically that you can't do both. You can't claim to merely lack belief in God and compare God to beings that you believe don't exist. And I think most people have that belief. They believe that Santa Claus does not exist. Now, maybe as a result of seeing this video, watching this video, you may want to take a step back and kind of like say, oh, no, I don't actually have the positive belief that Santa Claus doesn't exist. I just lack belief in Santa. And in that case, okay, that's okay. You can make that move. I just don't know that it's a good move to make.
Okay, so again, you're not exactly understanding the context in which any of this pops up in. For one thing, comparing a specific definition of a deity to a specific definition of a supernatural being is an apt equivalence, because you're comparing specific definition to specific definition. Like when we compare the Abrahamic God to Santa Claus or fairies, pixies, leprechauns, unicorns, like when we compare those two, those are perfectly fine comparisons, because most atheists out there would say that they know that the Christian God does not exist. This would be due to him not living up to the requirements document called, the Bible, that he simply doesn't live up to. And the Bible does not describe anything in reality. So the Bible being a description of this Yahweh or Abrahamic God, and it not living up to what we experience in reality, is the reason why we believe it to be false. That is our evidence. I mean, there's a lot more to go in. Like that entire topic is just, it's overflowing with different things that you could talk about as far as why Yahweh does not exist. But it is the same thing as saying that Santa Claus does not exist or that fairies do not exist. They have the same kinds of evidence. The descriptions of those beings do not match what we find in reality. And so therefore they do not exist because they don't describe reality in any kind of sense. So it's an apt comparison there. And you can definitely still be an atheist and hold to your non-belief in an ambiguous deity while also holding the position that the Abrahamic God does not exist.
But the person that I can't have a meaningful conversation with, is someone who is saying they're kind of a lack of belief styled atheist, but then all the time comparing God to entities and things that we actively disbelieve in, because it starts to sound disingenuous. And I'm not making a personal criticism of any particular person. I'm just asking you to consider that if you're that kind of a person. So that's the important thing there. On the one hand, you're stating on paper that you merely lack a belief, but then your language betrays that you're comparing God to things that you actively disbelieve in, and that's inconsistent.
No, it's not inconsistent. You're inconsistently having the conversation. Maybe we're not the ones being disingenuous here. Maybe you're the one that's just confused on what we're talking about. Because as I've stated throughout this entire video, there's a difference between an ambiguous deity and a specific definition of a deity. So don't be so quick to jump on the disingenuous train there, Braxton, because I don't think that you've actually thought out the different positions that any one atheist can hold. That would be a position on the ambiguous deity and then a position on your definition of a deity.
So the first objection that you've seen, and you actually listed them out for me, the ones that you've seen, is, well, you're taking casual comments about Santa Claus and comparing God to Santa and fairies and everything. You're taking these casual comments too seriously. So how do you respond to this objection to this challenge?
So all of these objections that they bring up, I think, are probably the weakest objections to this dilemma. Because the dilemma is based upon the false premise that the ambiguous deity that we're talking about is the same deity as the specific definition of a deity that we compare to other magical creatures. So you're starting off on a false premise with your hunter's dilemma. So any objection that they are bringing up here in this particular section are going to be the weakest arguments against it, just like this first one right here. I would say that this is a pretty weak argument against it. It doesn't really matter if we're using rhetoric when we're comparing the Abrahamic God to Santa Claus or any other supernatural being. It's just an effort to try to demonstrate to you how ridiculous your particular definition of God sounds to us. Because your particular definition of God makes as much sense to us as Santa Claus does. I mean, I have no idea why any child would believe that Santa Claus exists. Some big fat guy that can fit down a fireplace. He gives out presents because apparently he's richer than the top 1% of the world, and he's also a philanthropist, but he can also slip through some kind of alternate dimension or something like that to where he visits every single child, during the night. He's also got flying reindeers. Like, kids trust adults. Adults tell them that this Santa figure is real, reindeers can fly, and a fat guy can fit down a really small chimney, or appear in their living room, give them presents or something like that. Kids trust their parents, and I mean, they should. But the same could also be said about God. Your specific definition of God, not an ambiguous deity figure, because no, I really don't think that there's any household out there that's teaching about an ambiguous deity figure without giving some kind of definition to that deity figure, right? So kids trust their parents, and when they tell them that a magical man created everything out of nothing and sneezed on some dirt and made man, they're gonna initially trust their parents. I know I did. I trusted that bullshit story for like a good 25 years. And I still can't believe as an adult I actually believed that two people started the entire human race through brother, sister, cousin fucking, and then the world was wiped out by a flood, and then brother, sister, cousin fucking yet again populated the world. Looking back on that, that's a ridiculous fucking belief. And yeah, I know that didn't happen. I can assert that as a positive belief that that did not happen because there's evidence against that happening. My point is that kids will believe whatever you tell them. The same way with adults that believe in magical wizards that fart the universe out their ass.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, if that's what someone says, and I have seen that said, well, then the person is kind of indirectly admitting that this is not a true analogy to God. These are not truly analogous things. And in such a case, then we would just ask you to be consistent with your language, or clarify that you're being hyperbolic and God really isn't like Santa Claus or whatever else that you want to compare him to.
You just basically you've admitted that you're just being rhetorical. You're using a rhetorical.
Yeah,
you're not giving an argument. You're not making an actual salient point about theism. You're basically playing games and being pejorative.
No, I wouldn't say that that's what anybody's doing when they're comparing your specific Abrahamic God to Santa Claus. I mean, they're making a comparison of the two to show you how ridiculous it is. So, I mean, it's demonstrating something. It's not exactly an argument against it. It's demonstrating how ridiculous it is to that person.
Perhaps the atheist who takes the lack of belief approach should take this as a moment, forget that it's two Christian apologists on YouTube presenting this to you, and consider your own psychology for a minute. Because in psychology, we don't always know exactly why we hold the beliefs that we do. And that's why psychologists have jobs to help you find out why you believe what you believe and where you stand on things. And it could be that if you find yourself paralleling God to some of these types of things that you actively disbelieve exist, it might not be that I'm just being too literal with your casual language. It might be that you actually do disbelieve that God exists, actively disbelieve, and you should know that about yourself, and then that should change how you have these conversations. So,
Braxton, I mean, I feel like we're decent acquaintances, and I get that you're trying to honestly engage with the atheist community, and you really want to change the atmosphere, I guess, surrounding the topic of whether or not a God exists or your particular version of God exists. But sections like this just sort of scream pretentious windbag to me, and I feel like you bringing up, hey, you might want to go and talk to a psychologist is just very condescending and inhibits any kind of good conversation you could hope to have with your interlocutor. My advice would be, don't be a pretentious windbag and tell a person to seek a psychologist when your entire dilemma is based on a false premise to begin with. Like I said, it just makes you seem very condescending and pretentious. I mean, I noted this in my other video response to you in your 10 questions. I mean, the entire video I thought was fine, except for that one particular section where you really came off as just kind of a dick.
All right, so here's the second objection. Obviously, there are some differences between God and X, and put whatever you want in X, like Santa or fairies or whatever else. But the similarity is the lack of evidence. It's really about a lack of evidence. That's the whole point.
Well, I mean, I would agree. The comparison is meant to demonstrate how ridiculous each claim is. The evidence for your particular definition of God doesn't support his existence, just like any evidence that we have, evidence that we would have for, Santa Claus or any other supernatural figure out there. They would essentially be the same quality of evidence. They don't support the conclusion. Like, any evidence that anybody could present that leprechauns are real would not actually support the existence of leprechauns. And that's exactly the same way that all of the evidence that y'all have for your Abrahamic God doesn't support his existence. I get that you guys are convinced that he exists, but that doesn't mean that your conclusions have substantial enough evidence behind them to support those conclusions.
All right, another objection. So what if I genuinely do lack belief in Santa as opposed to believe that Santa doesn't exist?
Yeah, I don't think that anybody should describe it. I don't think that anybody should just lack a belief in Santa Claus. As far as the magical being of Santa Claus, I don't think that that's a good route to go, because I wouldn't say that anybody just lacks a belief in Santa Claus, because we don't have any proof to support the magical being of Santa Claus existing. So, I mean, I think that you could have an actively positive belief that he does not exist. I would also caution people in allowing apologists like this to push you into a corner to get you to admit something that, they want you to admit. Don't let them lead you to a conclusion. And that's essentially what they're trying to get you to do with Hunter's dilemma here, is they're trying to lead you to a conclusion to change your mind about something. But I think that if people just take a second and actually think about what this dilemma represents, you'll see that it's not a hypocritical position to have when you hold on to those two different positions, because they're two different conversations being had on those two different positions. So don't let apologists bully you into a corner and admit something that you normally wouldn't admit.
The last objection, and I think some people might even be leaving these in the live chat right now, is what do you mean by Santa? Because when we're talking about Santa, there was this sort of Saint Nicholas, and there were some true things about him. So it really depends on what we mean.
Again, another weak argument against Hunter's dilemma here, because we're obviously talking about a supernatural deity, and we're also talking about the supernatural being of Santa Claus, not some possible real historical figure that could have been the basis for Santa Claus, but the supernatural version of Santa Claus. So, I mean, I kind of feel like, I don't know if maybe Cameron misunderstood what they were talking about here or what, but because it kind of seems like if you flip it to, the God side of it, saying, oh, well, what kind of God are you talking about here? Is it this ambiguous God figure or ambiguous deity, or is it a specific definition? So, I mean, I feel like that is where the distinction really comes in at, not on the supernatural definition of Santa Claus or fairies or leprechauns or anything like that. The Hunter's dilemma, what it boils down to is it's based on a false premise that the ambiguous deity that we are agnostic about, that we don't know whether or not that God exists, that we have this lack of belief or non-belief in this deity, that is different than the conversation surrounding whether or not the Abrahamic God exists, to which I would say most atheists would say we know that particular God does not exist. We are agnostic about the ambiguous definition, but we are Gnostic about the specific definition. And that's what the two premises in Hunter's Dilemma represents. Your specific Yahweh or Abrahamic God definition is the exact same as Santa Claus, fairies, leprechauns, in the way of demonstrating how ridiculous the claim sounds to us. Those supernatural beings don't describe anything about how our reality works, just like your particular definition of God, being the Abrahamic definition, also does not describe how anything works in reality. That is where the comparison comes in. That's where it demonstrates how ridiculous it is, and that is the utility of comparing the Abrahamic God to Santa Claus. Well, that's it for me today, heathens. If you will, go down below. Let me know what you thought about Hunter's Dilemma. Do you think that it's an actual dilemma, or do you feel, like me, that they're just misunderstanding the context surrounding both of those statements? Let me know down below. Hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you want more videos like this in your feed. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens. And I would really love to hear what your thoughts are down there. Fuck me in the ass with a goddamn alarm.